Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning into the Anesthesia and Pain Management Success podcast. With APM Success, we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. We work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to another episode of APM Success. I'm really excited to be talking again to Tammi Caress. She's an estate planning attorney here in the Northwest. And we're going to talk today about estate taxes and the cost of dying. So it's true, it's somebody else's problem once you're gone. But in as much as you care about the ones you leave behind, it makes sense to exercise a little thought and emotional energy to what kind of situation are you leaving for your family whenever you're gone. So Tammi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Tell us about the costs of dying.
Oh gosh. Well, the biggest cost is estate taxes. That's huge. If you're in that level to have estate taxes, it's a big cost. The cost of going through probate, that court supervised administration, simply because there are a lot of requirements through the courts that you have to do in order to settle the estate, and those take money to go through those requirements, and also the length of time. Probate takes a lot longer typically than a trust administration. And just if you listen to the prior episode, I talked about delays. And if you're dealing with the courts, sometimes you're delayed just because the court is behind. And that takes time is money, right? So it takes more money when those things happen.
And so creating and funding a trust, and we're not going to treat this at length today, but just
Mhm.
in brief, is a good way to minimize the amount of your assets that go through probate, that court administered, laborious, technical process. You put it in a trust either before or, well, you can tell me if you do it in your will,
Yeah.
if that avoids probate, maybe it depends. And that will reduce the administrative burden.
Mhm.
Why is probate expensive?
Well, probate is expensive because there's court costs involved. So there's court filing fees. There are, depending on your jurisdiction, every jurisdiction is different, but some courts require or it costs money every time you file something. That's not necessarily true in Oregon and Washington, but the length of time um, it takes to go through it. So let me just kind of debrief or on the probate process. I'll try to do it quickly. But essentially, a will is what goes through probate. So when you said earlier that about trust and will, if you have a will, it actually is the document that puts you through probate if you have assets subject to the will. So a lot of people think that if I have a will, then I don't have, I'm going to avoid probate. That is not true. It depends on if you have a probate asset or not. And then the will goes through probate. The person who is nominated in that will has to get court certified papers in order for them to be able to act. So they have to file a petition with the court to get that permission. The court gives them back their papers. Then the court has several requirements. One of which is you have to do an inventory of all the assets and you have to file that. You have to publish notice in a local newspaper so that any creditors can make a claim against the estate. That costs money, and that also takes time because there's a 4-month waiting period before you can really do much. You have to wait until we know who all the creditors are. And then every year there's an accounting due. So every year that that probate is open, you have to file an accounting, and the accounting is expensive. And the reason it's expensive is most jurisdictions in Oregon and in Washington require an attorney. So I'm not doing the best plug for myself, but we cost money, right? So when we are preparing these accountings, we are it's very detailed, dollar in, dollar out, what's happened, and do we have the supporting documentation? Does it balance to the penny? So we have to prepare those every year. And then we also have to prepare those when we're closing the estate. So my goal is to always have estates. Hopefully, we can close them within a year. But unfortunately, a lot of times of what happens, especially if an estate is a larger size or more complicated, is we can't get it done in a year because there's taxes that have to be filed. And when you have a probate open, they will not allow that the courts will not allow you typically to close it if there's outstanding taxes that need to be filed and paid. So you're keeping that probate open just because even if you have everything done, because you have to wait to file those taxes. And then that you can't disperse assets until the probate is closed and the court gives you permission. So there you are, there's a year or more if you have a probate that's pretty straightforward. Um, if you don't, it could be even longer. I've had probates that are open for 5 years because we had someone who died who never filed their taxes. And guess what? They owned a business and
Yikes.
the personal representative had to go back and file all
Oh
those
my
taxes.
gosh.
It was insane. But so people who say, I'm not going to file my taxes, all you're doing is putting a burden on those you leave behind to do it for you. Um, so the process, not only does it cost money with the courts and publication to go through that process, but the length of time is, in my opinion, what increases the cost
Mhm.
um, of the probate.
There are, estate taxes obviously are administered in terms of state jurisdiction. So if you die in Oregon versus Washington versus New York versus
Yeah.
Florida, there's wildly different economic
Hmm.
implications for where
Hmm.
you live and where your estate is probated, and maybe it'll be in more than one state. So, can you give us a sense of either, here in the Northwest or some other states you're familiar with, what it looks like economically to die in that state,
Yeah.
and how they differ, and maybe are there, I don't want to call them havens, or we could call them strategies for
Yes.
taking advantage of if you live in a terrible tax jurisdiction, what you can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So estate taxes, it's important to note there's when we're talking about estate taxes, this is a one-time tax that is assessed as a result of a person's death and they own enough value in assets to be subject to the estate tax. It is different from income tax that you file every year. So the estate tax, one of the first things we do, and we have to do this before we can figure out how we're dispersing assets, is what are the assets and what are the value of those assets. So if a person died in Oregon as a resident of Oregon, or if they own property in Oregon, and property is like a house or land. Um, they're a non-resident owns property, or if they're a resident of Oregon, then if the total value of their assets, no matter where they're located, inside or outside of Oregon, is over $1 million, Oregon requires you to file an estate tax return. And the tax rate on that return is between 10 and 16%. So it can be significant in Oregon to be a resident there and die if you own a lot of assets. Washington also has an estate tax, but their threshold, and it just changed July 1st of 2025. Uh, their threshold is $3 million. So in terms of the threshold to be able to be subject to this tax, it is more favorable. However, their tax rate goes up to 35%. So that changed. It used to go up to 20% in Washington, but now the maximum tax rate is 35%. So when we're looking at, and I do this a lot, when we're looking at, okay, I have clients that say, I want to move, I'm thinking about moving to Washington for the tax reasons. We're going to do an analysis and we're going to see what really pencils out in terms of the estate tax. Um,
It's okay to live there, just don't die there.
Possibly, right? Yeah. That's actually California is a great place to die because there's no estate taxes,
Hmm.
but the income tax rate is pretty high, right?
Yeah.
And so is Washington, or so is Oregon. Washington doesn't have an income tax rate. Um,
It's funny. Oregon
So
is the worst of both worlds.
it is.
Sort of the average of Washington and California.
Yeah, yeah. So I have clients where I consult with that we're looking at different states for them to move to. And sometimes they have family in other states and we'll look and see, okay, well, what does this look like? How does this make sense? I have, some clients, I'm thinking of one in particular, but I won't share who it is, who they live in Oregon, but they travel so much, they're not in Oregon very much. And so we've actually looked at, well, does it make sense to actually establish your residency um, at, somewhere else? And it totally makes sense to do it because they're not in Oregon enough to justify having to be a resident there. So yeah, we can definitely go through those types of exercises, but we want to look at both income taxes and also estate taxes.
And then the idea of domicile comes into play. So, can you talk about what that is and how it should be sort of considered in the constellation of questions that somebody who's trying to minimize their tax liability might be considering?
Yeah. So different states have different rules. What I can tell you about Oregon in particular is if you are in Oregon for more than 200 days of the year, they automatically say that you are a resident, a domicile there. What that means is you're subject to their tax laws, income tax laws. So when people are considering moving to one jurisdiction or another, there's a lot of things that you can do, and it's actually kind of gray, quite frankly. It can kind of gray. People think, oh, if I just change my driver's license, I'm good. Not necessarily. Yes, you want to change your voter registration, you want to change your driver's license, but you also want to look at things like where's your doctor? Where do you go to the gym? What community involvement do you have? Because you can easily say, well, I'm going to move from Oregon, for example, up to Washington. And, but, I am all of my activities in Oregon, my community that I routinely visit or be a part of is in Oregon. My doctor's in Oregon. You know, that's giving Oregon a really good um, map to saying, you didn't really abandon Oregon. And that's kind of what a lot of jurisdictions say is, did you have an intent to abandon this place? And if that intent isn't fulfilled with all these kind of little outside forces, these little gray areas, you could be exposing yourself to Oregon claiming that you are a resident. Um, so that was just an example, but every jurisdiction is different. So you definitely want to look at the different laws of where you plan to be and where you're moving from.
If you have an eye towards tax reduction, does
Mm.
it typically make sense to, if I move, for example, from Oregon to California in order to enjoy the sunnier skies, as well as reduce my tax burden at death,
Mhm.
does it help you to have your estate plan redone and or a trust reformed, domiciled in the state to which you're moving? Is that part of the calculus at all?
Yes, I think it's a good idea. Not that you have to start over, but if move from one jurisdiction to the other, I always recommend, because I have clients move all the time and they say, can you still be my attorney? And it's like, well, I'm not licensed in that jurisdiction, so I can't give you that advice for that jurisdiction. But I always say you want to go and see an attorney in California or whatever it is, have them review your documents to see if there's any changes that need to be made. Because there's other things, not just estate taxes, there's homestead rules and things like that that you might be able to take advantage of in one jurisdiction that wasn't available in the other. So definitely you want your estate plan to be reviewed if you move out of state.
Can you give us a sense of how using something like a revocable trust would interact with all of these dynamics to
Yeah.
reduce probate cost and sort of ease the administration process and increase access to assets for the loved ones left behind.
Absolutely. So I am a huge advocate for revocable trusts. I think they are just a great tax planning tool and also a tool to reduce overall costs. So, what a trust does is it acts like a will in that the person who creates the trust says, just like their will, what happens when they die? Who are the beneficiaries? How are they going to inherit? Who is going to be the fiduciary in charge of settling the trust estate? And so forth. Um, so they're a great vehicle to avoid probate. And if you, I think I talked about this in our last podcast, but you know, their probate is a long journey. What a trust does is that we don't have those requirements to hold all the assets in the trust and not make distributions um, during the administration process. So if you have, sometimes you have a beneficiary who's in college and the person who died was paying for their school. Well, if they're a beneficiary of this trust, the trustee can continue making sure their school gets paid for while they're going through the administration. So in other words, we don't have to wait for the courts to allow us to tell us to make a distribution. We can actually start doing it at the beginning. The other thing is we can do everything in that trust administration that needs to be done. And maybe the last thing that needs to be done is the taxes. And we're kind of just waiting for that. We don't have to wait for the courts to tell us to go ahead and make these distributions out to the beneficiaries to give them their inheritance. A lot of times, what we do is we hold enough money back to make sure we have enough to pay all the taxes and we disperse everything out. So it can be a much quicker process. And in terms of estate taxes, what's really great about trusts is that you can design them in a way to minimize taxes. And this is really most true for couples, for married individuals who want to pay as little taxes as possible for the estate taxes. So, one thing that we do with trust is that anytime assets go to a surviving spouse, whether it's through a trust or outright, there's no estate taxes being assessed on distributions to a spouse. So we can design a trust in a way to kind of preserve the estate tax of the first decedent. The estate tax exemption amount is what we call it. So Oregon's exemption is 1 million. Washington's exemption is 3 million. We can preserve that so that it is not taxed when the person, first spouse dies. It's available for the surviving spouse to use during their lifetime, but when the survivor dies, that $3 million or whatnot is not taxed in the survivor's estate. So it's a really great strategy to minimize the overall tax burden.
Beyond trusts, what other tool, or beyond revocable trusts, what other tools are available and might you recommend to clients? And I always have people who are like, I know there's a magic way. What are the super rich people doing? So you can now demystify this for us. What are the other tools available to keep taxes as low as possible?
Well, when we're talking about estate taxes, one very easy, simple tool is gifting. So you can gift this year and next year. It's $19,000 per person annually. And what that means is you don't have to report this gift. So if you make a gift to any individual in a year that's more than $19,000, you actually have to file a gift tax return. Typically, there's no gift tax due, it's merely a reporting requirement. And I won't bore you with all the details of that. But if you're gifting $19,000 a year, say you have two children and you're married, you and your spouse can gift $19,000 to each child. And that's a way to remove money from your estate to keep your estate value down. I mean, that's one of the easiest simple things that you can do. The other thing is obviously charitable gifts. If you make gifts to charity during the year, you can take a deduction on your income tax return. And again, you're removing it from your estate so that it's not going to be subject to estate taxes. So those are very simple things that you can do. we can get even more complex. We talked earlier about family businesses, and there is a strategy to be gifting interest to family businesses at a discounted rate. I won't go into all the details, but it's a strategy to, again, gift some of the business assets over to children or family while maintaining control. You are removing assets from your estate, and you're also giving them a gift that, in the eyes of the law, can be reduced in value. So you're keeping your estate tax or your gift tax, you have a gift tax exemption on the federal level. Um, you're keeping that exemption lower. And I hope I didn't get too complicated there, but
Tammi,
there
on
it's
that item, can you give
yeah.
us maybe a little case study to just explain the mechanics of
Yeah.
valuation differential in sort of
Yes.
the different scenarios so that we can see the benefit of using one of those tools?
Absolutely. Okay, I'll do my best. So essentially, if you have a business and it's a family-owned business, and you want to start gifting some of your interest out to the children, let's say that it's an S corp. So it's a corporation, so there's shares in the corporation, and the um, the owner owns 100% of those shares, and they say, okay, well, I want to start kind of gifting some of my shares out to family. You can do that over time and not and use that $19,000 that you're not reporting. You can start gifting $19,000 in value out to other family members. But when it comes to valuing that gift, that actual value could be something like, I don't know, $30,000. But because we have these, it's called lack of marketability or minority interest discount, you can basically say, okay, well, this asset is $30,000 in value, but because it's a closely held business and there's minority interest, and because it's not as marketable out there, because it is a family-owned business, there's certain discounts on the value that you can take. And when you take that, it's a easy, not an easy, but it's a way of giving $30,000, but having it be valued at maybe 19. So it's a strategy. It's kind of a long-term strategy you can do over time. Or, you can make just big gifts. Um, all at once and file one gift tax return, probably no tax due, depending on the value of the gift, and do it in all one swoop. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. That's exactly what
Okay.
I was looking for.
Okay.
I'm sure you probably have people that come to you with a specific, like, I need uh, fill in the blank, like one of those four-letter acronyms type of trust, charitable,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
something trying to uh, trying to win sort of the tax game, and they have
Yeah.
this concrete thing that they think that they want. And
Hmm.
perhaps it's complex, perhaps it's costly, perhaps it requires a commitment of, like, you literally got to do this every year for the rest of your life. Are you sure you want to do that? So
Yeah.
describe some of the thought processes that you may engage in to assess the appropriateness of what may be a complex tool to either help someone implement that tool or perhaps guide them into something a little simpler. What kinds of questions would you ask them?
Well, so a lot of people, there's lots of questions. I always want to find out what's their main driving purpose. Okay. So if their main driving purpose is to reduce estate taxes and they want to do a charitable trust to reduce estate taxes and that's it, I usually don't like doing charitable trusts in those scenarios. That's because charitable trusts work when you have someone who is charitably driven. When they're not, usually they don't work as well. So I am looking to see what is the motivation behind it. And then from there, we give some options. So I'm happy to kind of go over some options
Sure, you can maybe give
if you
us
want
a sampling of one or two that
a
are the
sample.
highest volume
Yeah.
that you have come across your desk.
Okay. So I think the highest volume would either be a charitable trust or an irrevocable life insurance trust. ILIT is what we say for short. So with the charitable trust, when I have clients that own an asset and say they've owned it for 30 years and they paid very little money for it. And if they were to sell it, or maybe they depreciated it, it was a rental building and they depreciated it. And if they sell it, they're going to be taxed on all that appreciation and it's going to be a high income tax. So a charitable trust, if they're charitably motivated, is a great tool because you can actually make this trust, let's just say it's a building, say it's an office building, you put the office building inside of it. The building can then be sold and you're not going to be taxed on the appreciation. And then the proceeds from that sale go into the trust, and the proceeds will support either yourself as the person who created it, or maybe you're creating it for someone else. They'll get an income stream. And you can do it for a term of years. You can do it for the life of the beneficiary. And then when that term ends or the beneficiary passes, whatever's remaining will go to charity. So what's really great about that is you get a charitable deduction for the residuary. We calculate it by using actuarial tables. You get a charitable deduction for the amount that in the future will go to charity the year that you do that gift. And then also you can sell the asset and not have to pay all the taxes on it. So can be a really powerful, great tool if you are charitably motivated.
Is there a taxable event in the contribution of the property to the trust title in that
No,
circumstance?
no.
Okay.
Mm-mm. It's
The
not
wheels are
until
turning.
it's
This is a good
sold.
planning strategy I need to maybe consider for a couple people.
Absolutely. It's a really great strategy. Um, the other is the irrevocable life insurance trust. Well, before I go there, the reason I say you want to be charitably inclined for this charitable trust is every year you have to recalculate the value of that trust and then say the income interest is 10 or 20% going out to the beneficiary. And that's what determines how much they're receiving that year. Depends on how the trust is set up, and you have to file an income tax return every year. And you also have to file it with usually the state. There's some sort of filing requirement with the state when we're dealing with charitable trusts. So and you just can't pull money out whenever you want. You get a certain amount based on the value of the trust every year. So that's why I say you would need to be charitably inclined. When I have clients who did this and they're not, they're usually the ones who are they want to pull money out when they shouldn't, or they want to unwind it. That's a whole other thing that's not great to do. Um, so that's the charitable trust arena. Can be a great, valuable tool if all the right parameters are in place. Um, Irrevocable life insurance trusts are really great because you can get a life insurance policy. You set up this irrevocable trust. The trust is the owner of that policy. Typically, it's also the beneficiary on that policy. And when you set it up in this manner, what it does is whoever the insured party is, when they pass, say it's a $2-3 million policy, death benefit, it goes into this trust and it does not get included in the decedent's estate. So that's one thing people don't realize is when you have life insurance, the death benefit is actually included in your estate when you die. So I have a lot of folks that, they have young families, they have these term policies that are $2-3 million, and it's if something happens to you, that's going to be included in your estate. Um, so they're a great way to remove assets from the estate. A lot of times, especially our, ultra wealthy folks will have these kinds of policies specifically to have assets available to pay the estate tax. They're a really great tool if you have illiquid assets, because that tax has to get paid, and if you don't want to sell an illiquid asset, this strategy can be really good because you can use life insurance proceeds. So I think there's so many different tools But those two, I think, are the most common. The downside with ILETs is that, again, you have to pay that premium. And in order to do that, the trustee has to basically open up um, the beneficiaries. Basically, they open up for a certain window, a period of time for the beneficiaries to say that they want money out of the trust. And usually we set it up and beneficiaries will say, no, we don't want it. And then the trustee can pay the premium. But there is, paperwork that you have to do every year to manage these things.
It's funny. It sounds like one of those things. As long as everyone like behaves,
Yeah.
that's always my thing with irrevocable trust, and I've seen a few of these, and I don't know how you
Yes.
feel about them otherwise. It's like, oh, if I create this other entity that's like a separate entity, I can start getting assets out of my estate, and then I can keep my estate tax down. And I always say, well, yeah, but then it's not your asset anymore. That's why it's out of your estate. So if somebody who's the trustee on
Yes.
that trust wants to do something with it, there's nothing you can do about it. So there's always this
Right.
balance, this trade-off of control and
Yes.
taxability. It's like, well, if you want to have control, you're going to get taxed on it. And it's possible to avoid taxes, but you're going to reduce the amount of control you have over the asset. And as long as you maintain a good relationship and that person understands their role in the bigger picture, it can work. But those
Yeah.
types of strategies are not without some risk.
Exactly. And we definitely want to, I mean, I will say oftentimes when clients come in, say, I want an irrevocable trust for the reasons you just stated, I go through it and I explain, you are giving this asset away. It is no longer yours. Is that really what you want? And usually it's like, well, no. Then we talk alternatives. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, Tammy, thank you very much for joining us today. I learned a lot. So thanks to all our listeners who just wanted to listen in while I got my continuing ed credits here by talking to Tammy and learning a bunch of interesting things about trust strategies. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Anybody who's interested, who's in Oregon or Washington, reach out to Tammi Caress and her firm. They do great work here in Portland and surrounding.
Yeah.
And we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to apmsuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesia and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I'd also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on APM Success.